In this video, I'm not going to give you a list of 3 lenses and promise they'll make you a better photographer. What I will do is teach you about lenses so you'll know how to select the best lens for any situation, which is way more useful. Now be honest here, how many of you have asked Google at one point on your photography journey, what is the best lens for my DSLR? I know I did. I mean, this is going back like 15 years or so, but I still remember being utterly confused about what lens to buy. I think I ended up getting a 50mm to 300mm zoom lens or something similar. A lens that promised the world but actually delivered very little. And do you know why? Because a lens like that is, it's like a Swiss Army knife. It's a jack of all trades but a master of none. You see, photography is all about compromise. And by choosing a lens with such a wide focal range, I was compromising on other essential features. I just didn't realize it at the time. The first question you need to ask yourself is a pretty obvious one, but only in retrospect, and that is, what are you going to be taking photos of? Do you want to photograph landscapes or wildlife? Maybe you want to try your hand at street photography or portraiture. Pick the topic that matches your interests. I'm primarily a portrait photographer, so for me a typical situation involves taking photos where the dominant element in my photo is going to be a person or a model. And by dominant I mean where that person will fill up a large part of my frame. Alright, so now you've honed in on the type of photography you want to focus on, let's start looking at lens features. This idea of a model filling the frame is actually a really great place to start our lens selection process. That's because the space elements occupying the frame is determined by the focal length of your lens. What do I mean by that? The focal length of a lens, that's the number in millimeters you can find on the front of the lens, dictates what is called the angle of view. Now, angle of view is how much of the scene in front of your camera ends up in your frame, in your photo. A 16mm lens, like the one currently on my camera, has a really wide, sweeping 100-degree angle of view. That's why it's called a wide-angle lens. Wide-angle lenses are great for landscape photography, where you might want to take in the entirety of a scene. A portrait is different though. I often want the focus to be on my model, not on their environment. A 50mm lens achieves this by taking us from a 100-degree angle of view down to around a 40-degree angle of view. You can see my model now fills much more of the frame. You might be thinking, what if I just keep my wide-angle lens and walk right up to my subject? Wouldn't they just fill more of the frame then? Well, let's give it a go. So my model is now filling more of the frame, but if we do a side-by-side comparison, you'll notice that the composition is different. The bottom 60mm shot still includes way more of the environment than the top 50mm shot. And that's because when you zoom with your feet, when you walk forward or backwards, you're not changing the angle of view, which means you're not zooming, because zooming is changing the angle of view by definition. This is why understanding how your lens works is so important. I see a lot of photographers try and get the shot they want by just moving around. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can recompose that way. But once you understand the angle of view, you can much better control your end composition because you know when your lens is a limiting factor. Perspective distortion is the warping of elements in your frame. The warping it's relative to what you see with your eyes because your eyes are lenses as well. And in fact, the angle of view of your eyes is around about 45mm. This is actually why most portrait photographers are drawn to that 50mm lens, the nifty 50. It just feels right because it comes closest to recreating what we see with our own eyes. Distortion will start to occur as the focal length of your lens moves away in either direction from that normal focal range. To better illustrate this, I took 3 photos of Dan in the studio. The first at 16mm, the second at 50, and the third at 70. Barrel distortion is what happens when you use a wide-angle lens with a lower focal length. As you can see from the grid lines are being pulled outwards. It kind of looks like you're pulling the middle of the face towards the camera, and that gives you big, cartoonish nose and eyes. Not a very popular look. Pincushion distortion is what you get with a telephoto lens, and it kind of looks like someone is kind of pulling the ears out of the subject to the side. This is a lot to take in. Let's do a quick recap with the help of this handy graphic. The left side of this graphic is where wide-angle lenses live. They have the largest angle of view, which means they take in the entire scene in front of the camera. The wider you go though, the more barrel distortion you'll get. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the telephoto lenses. These lenses have narrow angles of view. The further you move to the right, the more pronounced a pin-cushion distortion is gonna become. Hopefully you can now see why portrait photographers don't often use lenses on the extreme ends of this spectrum. They just don't produce natural looking results. Based on what we've covered, you should now have an idea about the focal length of your ideal lens. So if you want to focus on landscapes, you're probably going to want a wide-angle lens. If you want to photograph wildlife, say birds, then a telephoto lens is a more logical option. As a portrait photographer, I would have narrowed down my lens choices to the middle of that focal length spectrum. There's no exact number here because you can use anything between 50 and 85 with no issues. Okay, let's continue narrowing down our lens choices. Aperture is the answer to the question, why don't I just get a 50 to 85mm zoom lens? And on the surface, that seems like a really valid question. Zooming, just so we're clear, is simply moving up or down the focal length range. So a 50 to 85mm zoom can take photos at any point in that range. At 85, it's set to its narrowest angle of view and therefore fully zoomed in. At 50mm, it would be at its widest angle of view and fully zoomed out. Okay, so the reason I don't suggest you go and buy a zoom lens is simple. Aperture. What is aperture? Aperture is the opening in the lens that lets light through. Aperture is measured in f-stops. The lower the f-stop, the wider the opening. So a wide aperture, for example f1.8, is going to let more light in than a narrow aperture, say f11. Now aperture is important to this conversation because it creates an optical phenomenon known as depth of field. Depth of field is a part of your scene where objects appear sharp in your image. And depth of field is why portrait photographers love lenses with wide apertures. A wide aperture can be used to separate a subject from its surrounding or from other subjects, like in this photo, where I used a narrow depth of field to focus the reader's attention on the female model. In this other photo, I've used depth of field to bring attention to the face rather than to the sumodog, which is bigger but less important to my story. So what do I have against zoom lenses? Well, zoom lenses, apart from the seriously expensive ones, rarely open up to much more than f4. And that's because zoom lenses are way more complex and therefore more expensive to engineer. A cheap prime lens, that's one with a fixed focal length, will open to f1.8 or f1.4. That difference might seem trivial, but it will make a huge difference to your photos. f1.8 will separate the subject from its background. f4 just won't do as good a job. So it boils down to this: unless you have a bulging wallet, a zoom lens will not have a wide enough max aperture to create the subject separation needed for most portraiture work. So where does that leave me on my search for a portrait lens? Well, I want a prime lens and not a zoom lens. And I probably want something that's between 35mm and 85mm. That's most of the work done really. Buying lenses can be expensive, but here's one more suggestion. Just buy them second-hand. I buy most of mine second-hand because once you inspect and test out a lens, there's very little risk in buying it. Another way to save money is to skip on the flagship brands, the Canons, the Sonys. I really like Canon lenses, but they're expensive, and third-party manufacturers do a very good job as well. I've had great Sigma lenses and a couple of good Tamron lenses. Most photographers will end up concentrating on one or two categories of photography. And this means the average photographer doesn't need to have lenses that cover the entire focal length spectrum. What we looked at today was how you can decide on the specific lens features you need for your photography, so you don't buy a lens with features you don't need and limitations you do not want. Okay, cheers guys.